An unconscious 21-year-old girl lies limp in bed. Scattered around her, crushed pills, an empty vodka bottle, and a typed suicide note confessing to the serial poisoning of 2 fathers. A frantic mother dials 911, begging dispatchers to save her dying daughter. But it is a trap. The crying woman on the line is the true architect of the massacre. She murdered her 2 husbands with antifreeze. Now, she is actively executing her own child to frame her for the crimes, forging a confession while her daughter's pulse slowly fades away. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The story begins in the frigid, snow-blanketed suburbs of upstate New York. Born Stacey Daniels, she grew up in Clay, a quiet municipality where life moved at a predictable, unassuming pace. She was perceived by neighbors and teachers as an entirely ordinary girl, blending seamlessly into the working-class fabric of her community. There was nothing in her early years to suggest the calculated, methodical violence she would later unleash upon her own family. By 1990, she had married a local man named Michael Wallace. Michael was a mechanic whose hands were perpetually stained with motor oil, a man known among his wide circle of friends for his easygoing nature and a deep-seated penchant for partying. Together, they built what appeared to be a standard middle-class existence. They had 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree, and quickly settled into the relentless routine of parenthood. From the driveway, the Wallace residence looked like any other home in the neighborhood, a quiet sanctuary of family dinners, school drop-offs, and weekend lawn chores. However, the carefully maintained veneer of domestic tranquility concealed a highly volatile reality. Financial strain constantly threatened to collapse their household. Michael struggled heavily with substance abuse, specifically alcohol and prescription drugs, which steadily drained their bank accounts and fractured their marriage. Stacey, who worked in a medical billing office, managed the depleted finances with an iron grip. She frequently complained to her colleagues and relatives about her husband's erratic behavior, detailing the massive debts he was accumulating. She presented herself flawlessly as the long-suffering matriarch, the responsible adult desperately holding the family together while her partner spiraled completely out of control. She told her friends that she was exhausted by the chaos, a narrative that perfectly positioned her as the ultimate victim of his recklessness. In the grueling winter of late 1999, with outside temperatures plunging well below 10 Fahrenheit, the dynamic inside the house shifted drastically. Michael, typically robust despite his heavy drinking habits, began to experience a severe and inexplicable physical decline. He developed a persistent, rattling cough and complained of extreme, paralyzing dizziness. His vision blurred constantly. He stumbled through the narrow hallways of their home as if heavily intoxicated, even on days when he had not consumed a single drop of alcohol. He described feeling a strange, freezing sensation radiating from his chest outward, while his kidneys quietly began to shut down. The scent of stale sweat and sickness permeated the living room where he spent hours curled on the sofa, clutching his abdomen. His skin took on a pale, sickly pallor. Stacey played the role of the dutiful caretaker, bringing him glasses of fluids to keep him hydrated, the very liquids that were systematically destroying his internal organs. She eventually took him to the hospital, presenting herself to the triage nurses as a highly concerned and frantic spouse. Physicians were baffled by his rapidly deteriorating state. They ran extensive toxicology screens and blood tests, suspecting a severe internal infection or late-stage complications from his known substance issues. Michael temporarily stabilized under their care, but the underlying corrosive cause remained unidentified. Feeling a false sense of recovery, he insisted on discharging himself and returning to the comfort of his own bed. The medical reprieve was brutally brief. In January 2000, his agonizing symptoms returned with fatal intensity. He was found entirely unresponsive in their home. Paramedics rushed to the scene of absolute chaos, attempting aggressive resuscitation maneuvers on the bedroom floor. but his heart had already stopped. The medical examiner, noting Michael's documented history of substance abuse and his relatively young age, suggested a thorough forensic investigation to determine the exact cause of the sudden cardiovascular failure. This is where Stacey exerted her ultimate chilling control. She vehemently refused an autopsy. She told the coroner that her husband had suffered enough in his final weeks, and that she could not bear the horrific thought of his body being dismantled on a cold metal table. Her grief appeared so raw, so utterly convincing, that the authorities relented and closed the inquiry. Michael Wallace's death was officially attributed to a massive heart attack. He was buried in the frozen, unyielding earth of a local cemetery, taking the horrific truth of his final days with him. For the next several years, the official narrative remained entirely unchallenged. Stacey promptly collected a $55,000 life insurance payout, using the sudden influx of funds to clear their immediate debts and secure her financial independence. The community rallied around the grieving widow and her two fatherless daughters. The lethal secret buried alongside Michael was perfectly preserved, waiting silently for the day when another body would force investigators to look back at the dirt. In 2003, the couple officially married, and Stacey seamlessly transitioned into a life of upper-middle-class luxury. They purchased a sprawling, expensive home, and the wide driveway was soon occupied by premium vehicles. Just as she had done in her previous marriage, Stacey swiftly positioned herself at the absolute center of her new husband's financial universe. She took over the administrative duties for David's company, managing the payroll, the accounting software, and the daily banking. She controlled the flow of every single dollar entering and leaving the household. However, the idyllic facade quickly began to fracture. David had an adult son from a previous marriage, and Stacey systematically worked to isolate the two men, creating an atmosphere of constant, bitter friction. More importantly, David was an astute businessman. By the summer of 2005, he began noticing glaring discrepancies in his company's ledgers. He confided in his close friends that his business was suddenly bleeding money, though he could not pinpoint exactly where the funds were vanishing. He told his associates that he planned to confront his wife and conduct a full, independent audit of the accounts. He never got the chance. The afternoon of Monday, August 22, 2005, was thick with the oppressive heat of late summer. At precisely 2 p.m., the silence of the Onondaga County 911 dispatch center was shattered by a frantic call. Stacey Castor was on the line, her voice trembling, laced with manufactured panic. She reported that her husband had locked himself inside their master bedroom the previous afternoon and had not responded to her persistent knocking for nearly 24 hours. She meticulously laid out the narrative for the operator. She explained that David had been deeply depressed over the past few weeks, heavily self-medicating with hard liquor. According to her timeline, they had engaged in a minor domestic dispute over the weekend. By Sunday afternoon, a heavily intoxicated David had stormed into their bedroom and engaged the deadbolt. Stacey claimed she assumed he just needed time to sleep it off, so she spent the night on the living room sofa. But now, a full day later, she begged the dispatchers to send help immediately, stating she feared her husband had done something terrible to himself. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the affluent residence within minutes. They found Stacey pacing erratically in the hallway, her face flushed, nervously wringing her hands. She pointed toward the heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. The house was completely silent, filled only with the muffled hum of the central air conditioning unit. Deputies approached the master bedroom, pounding their heavy flashlights against the wood and shouting David's name. There was no movement inside, no groans, no shifting weight, just a suffocating stillness. Evaluating the situation as a critical emergency, a deputy stepped back, raised his boot, and delivered a devastating kick to the door right next to the handle. The door jamb splintered violently, the metal lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the door swung open. The immediate sensory impact of the room was overwhelming. A cloyingly sweet, chemical odor hung stagnant in the air, mixing with the sharp stench of human sickness and stale liquor. David Castor lay flat on his back, diagonally across the center of the large bed. He was entirely unclothed. His skin had taken on a mottled, dark purple appearance, a forensic phenomenon known as lividity, indicating that blood had been pooling in his lower extremities for many hours. Rigor mortis had already firmly set in, locking his joints in a rigid, immovable state. He was undeniably dead, and had been for quite some time. On the polished wood of the nightstand, right beside his lifeless hand, sat the instruments of his apparent demise. There was a large, brightly colored plastic jug of pressed stone antifreeze. Right next to it rested a heavy crystal drinking glass, still half filled with a thick, syrupy, neon green liquid. A nearly empty bottle of Southern Comfort liquor lay discarded on the carpet near the foot of the bed. Standing in the shattered doorway, Stacey let out a piercing wail and collapsed against the wall. Through her tears, she repeated her carefully constructed story to the responding officers. She insisted that David was a miserable, broken man who had simply given up. She told them he had intentionally locked the door, poured himself a lethal cocktail of alcohol and engine coolant, and chosen to end his own life rather than face his inner demons. To the untrained eye, it was a tragic, straightforward suicide. A depressed man, a locked room, and a readily available poison. But the crime scene technicians, stepping carefully over the splintered wood of the doorframe, were preparing to look closer. Crime scene technicians stepped carefully over the splintered remnants of the master bedroom doorframe, their heavy boots muffled by the thick, plush carpet. The ambient temperature in the house was a comfortable 72 Fahrenheit, maintained by the central air conditioning unit David Castor had installed himself, but the atmosphere inside the room felt suffocatingly dense. The cloying, artificial sweetness of ethylene glycol masked the natural odors of death that were just beginning to emanate from the bed. Detectives stood at the perimeter, observing the tableau. To the untrained eye, the narrative was neatly arranged, almost too neatly. David lay perfectly positioned on his back. The half-empty bottle of Southern Comfort, the heavy crystal glass filled with neon green liquid, and the bright yellow jug of Prestone antifreeze were grouped together on the nightstand like props on a theater stage. The lead investigator immediately noted the physical inconsistencies. Ethylene glycol is a highly toxic, corrosive substance. While it has a famously sweet initial taste, consuming a lethal dose triggers a violent, agonizing physiological rejection. Once ingested, the chemical is metabolized by the liver into glycolic acid and then oxalic acid. These toxic metabolites aggressively attack the central nervous system, heart, and kidneys. Oxalic acid binds with calcium in the bloodstream to form jagged calcium oxalate crystals that physically shred the renal system from the inside out. This process requires hours of excruciating, paralyzing agony. A person attempting to drink a massive quantity of antifreeze would inevitably experience severe cramping, extreme nausea, and violent vomiting. Yet, the bed sheets were completely pristine. There were no bodily fluids, no signs of a physical struggle, and no evidence of the violent convulsions that typically precede death by this specific poison. David's body was rigidly calm, locked in a state of absolute stillness that directly contradicted the biological chaos of his final hours. The crystal glass on the nightstand presented another glaring anomaly. It was half full of the toxic mixture, but the rim was entirely clean. There were no lip prints, no smudges of saliva, and no residual drips running down the side of the glass. Furthermore, the liquid inside was perfectly separated. The dense, syrupy antifreeze had settled at the bottom, while a thin layer of amber liquor floated on top. If someone had recently picked up the glass, taken a heavy drink, and set it back down, the liquids would be mixed, and the inside of the glass would be coated. It looked as though the deadly cocktail had been carefully poured and placed on the wood surface, but never actually touched by human lips. Leaving the immediate vicinity of the body, forensic technicians fanned out across the sprawling residence. The house was immaculately clean. The polished hardwood floors of the hallway led to a massive modern kitchen. Everything was in its proper place. The countertops were wiped spotless. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under the recessed lighting. It was the home of a woman who maintained absolute control over her environment. A technician crouched beside the kitchen island and pulled open the lower cabinet housing the main garbage bin. The trash was mostly empty, containing only a few discarded wrappers and some crumpled paper towels. But buried near the bottom, half concealed by a discarded plastic grocery bag, was a standard plastic turkey baster. The technician pulled a high-intensity flashlight from his belt and illuminated the object. Inside the translucent plastic bulb and coating the narrow, tapered tip was a thick, sticky residue. The liquid was bright, undeniably neon green. The discovery of the kitchen utensil sent a shockwave through the investigation. A man committing suicide by drinking antifreeze does not use a turkey baster to ingest the poison. The item was carefully documented, photographed in situ, and placed into a sterile evidence bag. Subsequent forensic analysis of the baster yielded a terrifying, undeniable truth. The green residue was confirmed to be pure ethylene glycol. More importantly, the very tip of the plastic tube contained microscopic traces of saliva and epithelial cells. The DNA profile extracted from those cells was a perfect match for David Castor. The medical examiner's autopsy report completed the horrific picture. David had consumed a massive, fatal dose of engine coolant, but he had not done so willingly. Toxicology screens revealed that his blood alcohol content was exceptionally high, indicating he was heavily intoxicated before the poison was introduced into his system. The forensic conclusion was brutal and definitive. David Castor was incapacitated, likely passed out from the massive consumption of Southern Comfort. While he lay defenseless and unconscious on his back, someone had stood over him, pinched his nose shut, forced the plastic tip of the turkey baster deep into his throat, and squeezed the lethal, syrupy liquid directly into his stomach, bypassing his gag reflex entirely. The killer then washed the glass, poured a fresh mixture to stage the nightstand, and discarded the weapon in the kitchen trash. Detectives also analyzed the shattered bedroom door mechanism. It was a standard push-button privacy lock. Anyone could simply push the button on the inside handle and pull the door shut behind them as they left the hallway, perfectly sealing the tomb and creating the illusion that the victim had barricaded himself inside. The investigation instantly pivoted. The local sheriff's department was no longer dealing with the tragic suicide of a depressed local businessman. They were hunting a cold-blooded, methodical killer, and the only other person in the locked house during the 48-hour window of his death was his grieving widow. Detectives summoned Stacey Castor to the station for a formal interview. She arrived wearing the mask of a devastated wife, clutching a tissue and weeping softly into her hands. The investigators placed her in a small, windowless interrogation room, the stark fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the gray table. They did not immediately confront her with the evidence from the kitchen. Instead, they asked her to recount the events of the weekend one more time, urging her to provide every possible detail. Stacey complied, but her narrative began to fracture under the pressure of repeated questioning. She claimed that David had locked himself in the bedroom on Sunday afternoon, and that she had spent the entire night on the living room sofa, completely unaware of his suffering. But when detectives pressed her on the timeline, her answers became vague and defensive. She told the officers that she had knocked on the heavy wooden door several times on Monday morning, but assumed he was just ignoring her. The lead detective leaned forward, carefully resting his hands on the table. He asked her if she recalled seeing what David was drinking before he locked the door. Stacey hesitated, her eyes darting toward the corner of the room. She stated that he was drinking liquor. Then, the detective asked a highly specific, calculated question. He asked if she had seen any antifreeze in the bedroom. Stacey shifted uncomfortably in her metal chair. She told the investigators that she remembered seeing a green liquid in a glass. She said she even asked David what it was, and he told her it was just a special drink he was making. It was a fatal misstep. In her original 911 call and her initial statements to the responding deputies, Stacey had insisted that the door was deadbolted from the inside for a full day, and that she had absolutely no idea what her husband was doing in there until the police kicked the door open. Now, she was claiming she had seen the neon green liquid in his glass before he died. The detectives pressed harder, isolating her contradictions. If the door was locked, how did she see the glass? If she saw him drinking a mysterious green chemical, why didn't she call poison control or emergency services immediately? Why wait a full 24 hours while he slowly died on the other side of a piece of wood? Stacey began to stammer, her carefully constructed facade showing visible, jagged cracks. She claimed she was confused, that the trauma of finding his body was blurring her memories. She insisted that she was a good wife, that she loved David, and that he had simply given up on life because of his business failures. The investigators remained silent, letting her words hang in the stagnant air of the interrogation room. They knew the company was not failing. The forensic accountants they had dispatched to review David's ledgers were already reporting massive, unexplained withdrawals. Funds that had been funneled directly into accounts controlled exclusively by Stacey. The trap had snapped shut. The suicide note was absent. The crime scene was definitively staged. The weapon was found in her kitchen trash, and the financial motive was glaringly obvious. As Stacey sat in the interrogation room, dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, the detectives realized they were looking at a highly organized, predatory killer. But they also recognized the extreme difficulty of proving a circumstantial poisoning case in court. They needed more than a turkey baster and a life insurance policy. They needed to understand exactly what kind of monster they were dealing with. They decided to dig into her past, requesting the death records for her first husband, Michael Wallace. When the dusty file from the year 2000 landed on the detective's desk, detailing a young, healthy man who died of a sudden, unexplained cardiovascular event while under Stacey's care, the true, terrifying scope of her crimes finally came into focus. The transition from David Castor's closed-door crime scene to the dusty files of Michael Wallace marked a pivotal shift in the investigation. Detectives noted the chilling, undeniable parallels between the two cases. Both men were relatively young and otherwise healthy. Both suffered sudden, catastrophic physiological failures while completely isolated at home with Stacey. In Michael's case, the absence of an autopsy meant his death certificate simply read cardiovascular failure. However, the narrative his widow provided to the emergency medical technicians back in the freezing winter of 2000, the extreme dizziness, the staggering, the sudden inability to stay awake, mirrored the exact toxicological progression of ethylene glycol poisoning. By late 2007, the Onondaga County District Attorney's Office recognized they were not just investigating a staged suicide or a singular domestic homicide. They were tracking a highly organized Black widow. To prove it, they needed the one piece of evidence buried deep underground. A judge signed the unprecedented order to exhume Michael Wallace's remains. In September 2007, the morning air was crisp as heavy machinery rolled into the quiet, manicured cemetery. Investigators, forensic anthropologists, and cemetery staff stood by as a backhoe systematically removed over 5 feet of packed earth. The mechanical grinding of the diesel engine and the damp, metallic scent of overturned soil filled the air. When the steel bucket finally scraped against the concrete burial vault, the crew switched to manual tools, carefully clearing the remaining dirt by hand. Thick nylon straps were secured around the weathered casket, slowly hoisting it to the surface. It was a macabre, highly calculated intrusion into the past. The casket was immediately transported to the medical examiner's secure facility. Even after more than 7 years in the ground, the cold, anaerobic environment of the sealed vault had somewhat preserved the remains. Forensic pathologists did not need pristine organs. They only needed specific tissue samples. Ethylene glycol leaves a very distinct, indelible signature. When the poison metabolizes into oxalic acid, it binds with calcium, forming jagged calcium oxalate crystals that embed themselves permanently in the kidneys and brain tissue. The medical examiner extracted the necessary samples, sealing them in sterile containers for highly specialized toxicological analysis. The wait for the laboratory results was agonizing for the detectives. They monitored Stacey Castor's movements constantly, fully aware that a predator was walking free in their community. When the toxicology report finally arrived, it confirmed their darkest theories. Michael Wallace's tissues were saturated with massive, lethal concentrations of calcium oxalate crystals. He had not suffered a spontaneous heart attack. He had been brutally, systematically poisoned over a period of days or weeks, his internal organs physically shredded by the very same automotive coolant used to execute David Castor. The investigators now had two homicides, linked by an identical, highly unusual weapon and an identical beneficiary. But circumstantial poisoning cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute. A defense attorney could easily argue that both men were deeply depressed and chose the same method of suicide, or that the antifreeze was somehow ingested accidentally. To secure a conviction that would withstand an appellate court, the police needed a confession, or at least a highly incriminating slip of the tongue. They initiated a campaign of intense psychological warfare. Detectives secured warrants to tap the phone lines at the Castor residence and intercept her digital communications. Undercover units monitored her daily routine. Then, they began slowly tightening the net. They called Stacey back to the interrogation room for what she assumed would be routine follow-up questions regarding David's frozen estate. Instead, they dropped a forensic bomb. The lead investigator sat across from her, his expression entirely unreadable, and informed her that they had exhumed Michael Wallace. He stated unequivocally that they knew exactly how he died. The detectives observed her physiological reaction closely. There was no grief, no shock at the revelation that her first husband had been murdered. Instead, her breathing became noticeably shallow. Her eyes darted wildly toward the heavy metal door. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a classic defensive posture indicating severe internal panic. The police pressed their advantage, asking her directly how engine coolant ended up deep inside the renal tissue of a man buried 7 years ago. Stacey deflected, her voice trembling. She suggested that perhaps the embalming fluid used by the funeral home contained the chemical, a desperate and scientifically impossible excuse. The investigators methodically dismantled her lies, presenting the timeline of David's death and reminding her of the turkey baster found in her kitchen trash. They did not arrest her that day. It was a strategic, calculated decision. By letting her walk out of the station, they knew she would be consumed by paranoia. She knew they were watching her. She knew the $1 million life insurance payout was frozen indefinitely, and she knew that a grand jury indictment was imminent. The wiretaps recorded her frantic phone calls to family members, her narrative shifting wildly as she tried to plant seeds of doubt regarding the police's competence. The pressure was absolute. Stacey was trapped in a tightening vice of forensic evidence and relentless police scrutiny. Every time a patrol car drove past her affluent home, every time the phone rang, she felt the walls closing in. But the detectives severely underestimated the depths of her depravity. They assumed a cornered suspect would eventually break down and confess, or perhaps attempt to flee the jurisdiction. They never anticipated that a mother facing the prospect of life in a concrete cell would look at her own flesh and blood and see a disposable pawn. Faced with the terrifying reality of a concrete cell, a cornered predator will inevitably lash out. But the sheer depravity of her next calculated move defied all basic human instincts. She did not attempt to flee the state or secure a high-profile defense attorney. Instead, she looked at her eldest daughter, Ashley, and saw a disposable asset, a biological pawn that could be sacrificed to satisfy the authorities. The plan required a dead scapegoat. A living suspect could mount a defense, stand trial, and testify against her. But a corpse holding a confession would neatly close the files on both homicides, exonerating the mother entirely. The chosen victim was in her early 20s, attending local college classes, and still entirely trusting of the woman who had raised her. Ashley had already lost her biological father and her stepfather to sudden, inexplicable tragedies. Now, her mother was quietly preparing to make her the third casualty of the household. The execution of this ultimate betrayal began on a seemingly mundane Thursday evening, September 13th. The mother invited the young woman over for a drink, suggesting they needed to unwind and de-stress from the relentless police harassment. She presented the invitation as a moment of much-needed maternal bonding. They sat in the very same house where the previous murder had been orchestrated, surrounded by the heavy, oppressive silence of the affluent neighborhood. The drinks were prepared in the kitchen, a lethal, meticulously measured cocktail of premium vodka, sweet soda, and a massive quantity of crushed prescription sedatives and painkillers. The mother handed the heavy glass to her child. The liquid was thick, the bitter chemical taste of the crushed pills barely masked by the sugar and alcohol. When the daughter complained about the terrible, chalky flavor, she was firmly encouraged to finish it. She was assured that the strong mixture would help her sleep, help her forget the extreme stress of the ongoing homicide investigation. The central nervous system of the young woman began to shut down within minutes of ingestion. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room turning dark. Her limbs grew incredibly heavy and unresponsive. She slumped back against the furniture, her breathing growing dangerously shallow as the massive pharmaceutical overdose took effect. The mother sat across from her, watching the pulse in her own child's neck slow to a crawl. There was no panic, no sudden rush of maternal regret, just the cold, methodical observation of a predator waiting for the venom to take full effect. Once the girl was entirely incapacitated, the staging phase commenced. The mother dragged her limp body to the bed, then moved into the glow of the home office computer monitor. The mechanical clicking of the keyboard echoed through the quiet hallways as she drafted a masterpiece of manipulation. It was a typed, 750-word document designed to look like a desperate, guilt-ridden suicide note. The text was highly specific and deeply cynical. It confessed to the poisoning of the biological father years prior, claiming it was a teenage mistake born of extreme anger. It then detailed the murder of the stepfather, providing operational details about the turkey baster and the automotive engine coolant. The narrative was crafted to perfectly align with the circumstantial evidence the detectives had already gathered. It ended with a plea for forgiveness, stating that the psychological guilt had simply become too heavy for a young mind to carry. She printed the document, carried the warm paper back to the bedroom, and placed it prominently on the mattress beside her comatose daughter. To complete the horrific tableau, she scattered crushed pills across the nightstand and left the empty liquor bottle discarded on the carpet. It was a meticulously constructed scene of self-destruction. She then went to sleep in another room, fully expecting to wake up to a corpse. But the human body is remarkably resilient. The next morning, the mother entered the bedroom and discovered her daughter was still clinging to life. Her breathing was a wet, rattling gasp, her skin pale and clammy, but her heart had not stopped beating. Frustrated by this biological defiance, the mother attempted to force more pills down the unconscious girl's throat, but the natural gag reflex rejected them. Running out of time and options, she initiated the final phase of her performance. She dialed 911. She screamed into the receiver, weaponizing her manufactured panic. She begged the dispatchers to send an ambulance immediately, claiming she had just found her child entirely unresponsive. It was the exact same theatrical hysteria she had utilized when discovering her second husband's body. First responders swarmed the residence. The flashing red and white lights reflected off the perfectly manicured lawns of the suburban street, drawing the attention of neighbors. The social echo was immediate and profound. The community was paralyzed by the sheer volume of tragedy emanating from this single house. Whispers circulated that the family was cursed, while others began to suspect something deeply sinister was festering behind those walls. Paramedics found the young woman in critical condition, her core temperature dropping rapidly. They initiated aggressive life-saving measures right on the bedroom floor, fighting to stabilize her plummeting blood pressure before rushing her to the nearest medical center, where doctors immediately began pumping her stomach to remove the toxic sludge. Meanwhile, patrol officers secured the bedroom. They immediately spotted the printed pages resting near the scattered pills. The midpoint pivot of the investigation occurred right there in the master suite. An officer read the confession, his eyes scanning the 750 words that neatly wrapped up two massive, open homicide investigations. For a brief, dizzying moment, the authorities were completely thrown off balance. Could this quiet, unassuming college student truly be the serial poisoner they had been hunting? The note seemed to explain everything: the easy access to the house, the intimate knowledge of the victims, the total lack of forced entry. It was the ultimate red herring, served on a silver platter. The detectives arrived at the scene, processing this sudden, jarring shift in the narrative. They bagged the suicide note as prime evidence. If the girl died in the intensive care unit, the case would likely be closed, her guilt permanently cemented by her own printed words. But as the lead investigator reviewed the text in the harsh fluorescent light of the precinct later that afternoon, a glaring, fatal anomaly jumped off the page. The confession was detailed, but it was littered with specific phonetic misspellings. The most damning error was hidden in the description of the murder weapon used on the stepfather. The author of the typed note had misspelled the word antifreeze. It was typed exactly as anti-free, missing the final letter entirely. The detective froze. He immediately pulled the audio recordings from the grueling August interrogations with the grieving widow. Fast-forwarding through the magnetic tape, he listened closely to the suspect's voice. In every single interview, when discussing the engine coolant found near her husband's body, the mother had consistently dropped the final consonant sound. She pronounced the chemical precisely as anti-free. It was a unique, highly specific linguistic quirk. The trap had not snared the daughter. By attempting to execute her own child, the architect had finally provided the police with the undeniable proof they needed. The young woman's recovery in the intensive care unit was a medical anomaly. Against massive physiological odds, Ashley slowly regained consciousness. When investigators approached her hospital bed to ask why she had attempted to end her own life and confessed to a double homicide, she reacted with absolute bewilderment. She vehemently denied writing the document, insisting she had no knowledge of any poisonings or the lethal engine coolant. Computer forensics experts immediately seized the hard drive from the family's home office. The digital footprint was entirely damning. Technicians recovered the hidden metadata for the 750-word text, proving it was drafted, edited, and printed during a specific window of time when Ashley was miles away attending college classes. The keystrokes were definitively linked to hours when only the mother was inside the residence. In 2009, the widow stood trial. Prosecutors presented the lethal turkey baster, the exhumation toxicology reports, the forged confession, and the undeniable linguistic quirk of the missing final consonant. The defense attempted to paint her as a victim of circumstance, but the jury dismantled the facade within hours. She was swiftly convicted of second-degree murder and attempted murder, receiving a sentence of 51 years to life behind bars, guaranteeing she would never walk free again. The story of the Black Widow concluded quietly behind concrete walls. In June 2016, she suffered a fatal heart attack in her cell, having never expressed a single moment of remorse. Her sudden demise brought a grim closure to the legal saga, but no true peace for her surviving victims. Ashley and Bree are condemned to navigate the rest of their lives carrying an unimaginable psychological burden, forced to reconcile the memory of a seemingly devoted mother with the cold reality of a predator who viewed her own flesh and blood as disposable collateral. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.